Welcome to today's talk, which is entitled Sleeping Beauty, Why Sleep Isn't for Rest, but for the brain to do some spring cleaning. I'll start off with some housekeeping. You're watching this either through Facebook or through Eventbrite. If you're watching it through Facebook, then please do the liking and any comments and questions on the chat. I'll be speaking for about 45 minutes and then I'll answer questions at the end. So do wait for the Q&A at the end. Enter your questions. I will take the questions towards the end, but you can enter the questions at any point during the talk. If you're a tweety person, then please tweet about this and hashtag me as the brain guy and our talks as our talks. We're also across different social media platforms. So if you're on those, please follow us on those and also talk about us. For some of you, this isn't your first talk, but for some, it will be your first talk of my lockdown talks. This is actually talk number 21. I started over a year ago, and now this is series number 4 of my talks. I've got a YouTube channel onto which we upload all of the talks after they've been downloaded and edited. That does take some time depending on how busy we are, but you can find all 20 of the previous talks online, and this talk will go on there as well. And if you subscribe to the channel, which is for free, you will get all my subsequent talks and also other materials that we will be putting on there as we go forward. So please do subscribe. I would like to start off with welcoming everyone, and I'm thrilled that over the last year we've managed to get quite a following from around the world, and I hope that your language is represented here. The one in the middle is our new one. This is especially for Graham Pluck and his team at the university in Bangkok. So Sawadee Ka to you all. Welcome to our talks, and let's hope that we see more of you. And this is a map of where in the world we think people are listening in from. If your country is not represented there, then please do let us know, because I love colouring in that map. So if your country is not in red there, then just let us know and we will fill it in for subsequent talks. I like to get my thanks out of the way first, because it's important that you realise that while I'm the front piece for the organisation, I'm actually here because of the work of lots of wonderful young people who are working with me, and these are the people, Oscar, Claudia, Dominic, Francesco, Anisha, Andrea, Kim, Denisa, Elika, Vitote and Disha. For this talk in particular, I want to single out thanks for the people in the middle, right at the top, Claudia and Dominic, who've given me lots of wonderful stuff for this talk. So thank you to them. Without them, this talk would not be happening. As an overview, what I'm going to start with is what is the impact of poor sleep. Excuse the grammatical error there. And then I'm going to move into how much do different animals sleep, how our sleep changes over our lifetime, what is the architecture of sleep, and then finally the cognitive benefits of sleep. So effectively, I'm going to start by scaring you. I'm going to tell you how terrible it is if you don't sleep well, the things that can go wrong, etc. And then I'm going to move forward and show you what the benefits of good sleep are and why we need to be careful on that front. So to start with, usually I end the talk with a picture of my mother, but for this I'm going to start with the picture of my mother with our dearly departed cat, Twit Cat, who when my mum would have a nap in the morning, Twit Cat would sleep on her to make sure that she was sleeping properly. So here you've got two different species sleeping together. So what is this sleep for? Why do we do it? Is it useful? Is it just for physical rest, etc.? Now, the way that I like to start is to, well, scare you, because we need to know what this thing is for by looking at it when it's not working. And as a neuropsychologist, that's the a methodology we tend to use. We look at the effect of brain damage to demonstrate the impact on cognitive functions. Here I'm not talking about brain damage, but I'm going to be talking about when things go wrong. So what are the impacts of poor sleep? I'm going to start with this study which looked at road safety, and it looked at sleep deprivation and motor vehicle car crash involvement. And this is a study done in the States where they looked at the probability of having a motor car crash if you'd had less than 4 hours sleep, 4 to 5 hours, 5 to 6, 6 to 7, and then more than 10 hours sleep. And they split it up into whether it was a single vehicle crash where the individual just crashed into, let's say, a barrier or something like that, or a multiple vehicle crash where they also injured other people. Now, the main point from this is the fact that the less sleep you have, the greater the likelihood is of a car crash. So that doesn't seem surprising, but it's pretty scary. Deaths through poor sleep on roads is a major thing and needs to be avoided. Now let's look at physical efficiency, because we consider sleep to be about physical rest. So presumably poor sleep has an impact on our physical efficiency. So when we look at the military combat forces, high octane executives, and working parents, and some of you will be working parents, we know that sleep deficit is an epidemic. We know that people who don't sleep well end up being grouchy, they don't perform well, etc., etc. So there are consequences to poor sleep. Now, this has been also linked to high rates of physical illness, disease, and obesity, as well as declines in cognitive function and job performance. So the consequences of poor sleep are quite widespread. They can impact your immune system, therefore opening you up to illness and disease, etc. And there are links to our diet and the way that gut bacteria work, apparently, and sleep. But even on sports performance, you can see this. Now, this is a study which looked at National Basketball Association, I think NBA player performance, who they looked at people who had more than 8 hours sleep or those who'd had less than 8 hours sleep. And they found that those who had less than 8 hours sleep, they committed, so these are in red, they committed more fouls, increase in turnovers, whatever that means in basketball. I used to know, but I stopped caring. But basically, it's not good. Whereas those who sleep more than 8 hours, in green, they end up with more points, increase in the number of minutes they can play without injury, more points per minute, etc. So effectively, what we see here in a highly physical world is that more sleep is good for you, bad sleep is very bad for you. So we can see that. Now, due to COVID and the lack of sporting venues being able to open, and therefore a lot of professional teams having to basically stay grounded, this rather interesting study was undertaken looking at teams that were working or playing within a bubble within their local areas. And the idea here was to look at what happens with basketball players when they have to travel, because in the States there are three or so time zones, or is it four? I can't remember. And you can have a team that's on one coast of the country having to fly across to the other coast to play their away matches. So what McHale and Chinoy did is to look at the statistics for basketball players and the team's performances before COVID, and then they compared them to what was happening during COVID when the teams were grounded and could only play within their local bubbles. Now, the details aren't important, but what was found, if we just look at data before COVID, is that when a team was playing at home, they had their winning percentage was, let's say, 65% or so. And that's the standard thing that you tend to get in sports, that when teams are playing at home, there is a home advantage. But then if they're having to travel either within their own state, so that's a zero time zone shift, or one time zone shift, two time zone shift, what we see is that the winning percentage goes down. So we've got that advantage of playing at home, but we also see that there is a relationship between the performance and how far they've got to travel. And anyone who's done any sort of long distance travel knows how it messes up the body clock. And what we see here is a manifestation of it in the performance of the basketball teams. Interestingly, there were different effects depending on whether you traveled west, or the players traveled west, or they traveled east. And this is to do with the fact that traveling in one of the directions, and I think it's if you travel west, it has less of an impact on you than if you travel east. And this is to do with how much your body is having to catch up or put behind. So, for example, I think if I fly across to North America, I just extend my day. Whereas if I fly east, let's say to India, then my day gets shortened. So there are different impacts on the body of traveling three time zones to the west or three time zones to the east. So what we see here is a manifestation of the impact of sleep disruption on performance, and the more disrupted, the worse the performance. As a result of COVID, some of these teams had to stay in their local areas, and therefore they only played local teams when they did play anyone. And what happened here is that when teams were home or away, but away being literally in the same state, there's no advantage. So what we see here is that although playing in front of your own fans, etc., is better, the traveling seems to have an impact, and that traveling is having an effect on the body via what's happening in the brain, because it's a complex area, but there are sleep monitors, clocks across the whole body, and these are all being disrupted by this travel. Okay, moving on to mental health and substance use. Work has started demonstrating the impact on adolescents of poor sleep. Now, this is particularly important because an adolescent brain is developing, and because it's developing and changing all of the time, any disruption to that because of not getting the sleep patterns that are necessary could result in long-term difficulties. Now, in this study, what these researchers did was to look at the amount of sleep that adolescents had, and they looked at the percentage of participants who had attempted suicide in blue, considered suicide in yellow, or had hopeless thoughts. And what we see is a really, really clear pattern there, that the poorer the sleep, the higher the level of these negative thoughts, and especially the suicide attempts. So that's not good news. Then when we look at the use by adolescents of tobacco, cigarettes, or alcohol, which at that age they shouldn't be using, and then illicit prescriptions or illicit drugs or prescription drugs, what we see again is a similar pattern, that the worse the sleep, the greater the likelihood of these adolescents using these substances. I'd like to point out that on the right hand side of each graph there's a bit of a kink going up for 10 hours, which demonstrates that it's not a case of more is more or more is better. There is an optimal amount of sleep, so about 9 hours. Beyond that, actually, there are detrimental effects. So that demonstrates that sleep isn't something that you just have more and more of. There is an optimal amount which is good for you, and beyond that, you might be having negative effects on yourself. Now, moving into adult mental health, the unfortunate finding is that in every psychiatric disorder that we know, there is some sort of sleep disturbance. Whether it's insomnia, so sleep difficulty, or hypersomnia, which is too much sleep, or quality of sleep, nightmares, altered sleep-wake cycles, daytime sleepiness, etc. So from schizophrenia to depression, mania, anxiety disorders, PTSD, dementia, delirium, eating disorders, and ADHD and autism, a common theme here is some sort of sleep disturbance. And that probably isn't a coincidence. When Claudia was looking for research for me to show in this talk, she put sleep and psychiatric disorders into one of the databases that we can look into for research studies. And so just putting in those two terms, sleep and psychiatric disorders, she could have found 2,899 papers, which means that there's a lot of research out there that's demonstrating that there is a link between poor sleep and psychiatric disorders. So this isn't a coincidental finding. There is obviously something going on here, which then led to this very recent study in Lancet Psychiatry by Freeman and colleagues, who said it is argued that insomnia and other mental health conditions not only share common causes, but also show a bidirectional relationship, with typically the strongest pathway being disrupted sleep as a causal factor in the occurrence of other psychiatric problems. So what that is suggesting is that this isn't just a coincidental finding, and it's not one directional. It could be that the poor sleep that is related to mental health conditions actually might be exacerbating those very psychiatric problems and possibly bringing on other psychiatric problems as well. So we shouldn't see sleep as a separate thing. It might be part of the problem, and therefore health services should consider incorporating the assessment and treatment of sleep to help these patients. And the professionals who are working in mental health should get more training on sleep disruption and its treatment. So whereas one might have seen sleep as an extra symptom, it seems that there is possibly a causal role played here, and it's a complex one, but it certainly shouldn't be seen as something that just needs to be treated with a sleeping pill, whilst the main psychiatric problem is considered separately. They should be considered together. Now, the final thing I'm going to scare you with is aging in dementia, and I need to do this because it's the truth, and as a scientist I have to tell you the truth. Now, in this study in the States, they looked at sleep fragmentation, which is basically a measure of how sleep can be broken. I'm not going to define it, but it's a way of looking at the disruption of sleep. Even if it's 8 hours, it can be broken up, and therefore the fragmentation. And they looked at the risk of the Alzheimer's disease and general cognitive decline in older people. Now, the study itself is complex, involving complicated mathematics, but the important thing is that they looked at what they call the cumulative probability of developing Alzheimer's disease. So this is something that if you have more and more of a particular problem, then you have an increased risk of something else happening. So along the x-axis, we've got time in years of fragmented sleep. The dashed line is low fragmentation, so not too much broken sleep, whereas the full line is for high amounts of sleep fragmentation, so a lot of broken sleep. And what we see is that if you have more broken sleep, the likelihood of you having this increased probability of developing dementia or Alzheimer's is increased. So there's a link here. Now, what is the chicken and what is the egg is difficult to say, but there's certainly a link between fragmented sleep and potential risk of developing dementia, Alzheimer's. And in this graph, what they've shown is that the years that the participants spent in their study, because this was a longitudinal study where they tracked participants for a number of years, and they looked at what's called global cognition. So this is a complicated measure which takes into account lots of different things to do with memory, attention, etc. And the main thing from this is that, again, we've got the dashed line as the people who had low levels of fragmented sleep. So that means that their sleep wasn't as broken, whereas the full line is people who had high levels of sleep fragmentation, so a lot of fragmented sleep. And the finding is pretty clear that although cognitive decline is going to happen to most of us, I mean, it just is something that is one of the facts of the brain declining as we get older. It seems that the decline is more rapid if you have fragmented sleep. So this is something to be aware of, and if there are ways to try to improve your sleep, work on it, etc., it may have a positive impact in terms of staving off any cognitive decline that you may be about to suffer. So that brings me to that age-old question: do cats really sleep all the time? The answer is, well, a lot of the time. These are two of our lovely cats. You saw Twit Cat earlier, and we see her identical twin sister Tina there. They slept a lot at home, but we did see them awake every now and then, so it wasn't a full 24 hours a day. But they're not the biggest sleepers of the animal world. So here we have the average daily sleep totals for different animals. And what we see is that those lanky things, the giraffes, they only sleep for 1.9 hours a day. The lovely heffalumps, elephants, they sleep for about 3.5 hours. We sleep for a third of the day, 8 hours. I didn't even know dolphins slept, but they apparently sleep for 10 hours. Gerbils about 13 hours, and that's about apparently the amount of time a cat sleeps. I think it's about 13 hours, or maybe it's 20, I'm not sure. Whereas brown bats, they're really lazy. They spend almost 20 hours sleeping. So what we see here is differences across the animal kingdom in terms of amount of rest or through sleep that is needed. Sleep also changes through our own lifetime. So although 8 hours is what we see as adults, there are changes that happen, and any of you who've had children will know that they sleep a lot. So a newborn infant across the day from 6 o'clock in the evening through to 6 o'clock the following day, they'll have lots of periods of sleeping and then waking up. Whereas we typically tend to sleep during the night, let's say from 11 o'clock till 6 or 7 o'clock. So we have one period of sleep for about 7 to 8 hours, whereas an infant has a number of sleep cycles, and an adolescent will sleep more than us. So there are differences. So as we get older, we sleep more, we seem to sleep a bit less. When we're babies, it's about 14 to 17 hours, a bit less than when we're toddlers. Then by the time that we're adolescents, about 9 to 11 hours, and then as adults, it's 8 to 10. Then going to about 7 hours, but then as we get older, it does seem to reduce a bit. So there is a change in our sleeping cycles. Um, there are complex issues there to do with physical tiredness, but also with what the brain is requiring. And one of the big things is that the baby's brain and the toddler's brain is rapidly changing. And what I'm going to demonstrate is that that change has a real impact on us, and we think that that's a cognitive change. So now I'm going to look at the architecture of sleep, which is to do with the fact that sleep isn't just zoning out and that's it. There are complex things going through sleep. These are brain waves that can be picked up on the scalp using electrodes, and there are different frequencies of brain waves. So a beta wave, which the details aren't important, but which is between 14 and 30 hertz, it usually represents awake with the mental activity, whilst an alpha wave is awake but resting, whereas theta is while we're sleeping, and then deep sleep, but which is below 3.5 hertz, has a very different look to it. Now, when we look at what the brain waves are like during different stages, during wakefulness, we've got that beta activity. During what's known as non-REM sleep, which is really important for our learning, we see a very, very different type of sleeping pattern going on, brainwave going on. And it's rather paradoxical, because in REM sleep, which is known as rapid eye movement sleep, what we have is a brain pattern that looks like we're awake, even though we're completely asleep. There are different things happening during these different points in time, and those change across the night as well. So let's say you go to sleep at 11 o'clock. You don't have, we typically go through 5 cycles of sleep through 8 hours. We typically start off with this non-REM sleep, where there is just this slow wave going on, and we're in this very deep type of sleep. But then slowly across the night, what you see is that the amount of REM sleep begins to increase, and the REM sleep is the one in which you do most of your dreaming. So we're not actually dreaming for all 8 hours, we're only dreaming for a proportion of the time that we're asleep. Now in one of these states, the brain is just completely, it's not really doing much, and your body is quite limp, it's not, you don't really move, you can move, etc. Whereas in the other one, your brain is working really, really rapidly. It's doing a lot of work and your body isn't moving. So there are quite big differences between this REM sleep and non-REM sleep. And that's important because of the cognitive benefits that we are beginning to understand this REM sleep and non-REM sleep gives us. And this brings us to this really marvelous finding, which is that maybe sleep is to do with an evolutionary advantage. Now, when we look at the different primate species and we compare the amount of REM sleep versus non-REM sleep in Homo sapiens, so us human beings, through to other animals, through other primates, I don't know the Latin names, but baboons, chimpanzees, orangutans, etc., etc. The big thing is that we spend the largest proportion of our sleep in REM sleep. So for us, it's about 20% of all of our sleep, which is higher than for any other animal. And we also see any other primate. And we also see that we spend the least time sleeping. So there's something going on here. We spend the least time sleeping, and we have the highest proportion of this REM sleep, which we think is really important for learning. Now, this guy is called David Sampson, and he's done some remarkable work on the sleeping patterns of different types of primates. And one of the things in his work that he points out is that some animals, including some primates, they sleep in quite uncomfortable upright positions, like the baboon that's in the top of this photograph. And that is effectively a guarded position to get ready to fight, attack, flee, etc. So an upright position is because of potential danger. Whereas that lovely orangutan on that the pink cloth, that orangutan doesn't give a damn. It's completely out for the count. So it's tempting to think that that orangutan is really feeling quite safe and is able to fully rest. So this is work that David Sampson did for his PhD, and there's been this remarkable BBC documentary series called Chris Packham's Animal Einsteins, and I'm going to hand over to Chris Packham. This is a 2.5 minute excerpt from one of the episodes on the builders, so I hope you can hear this. Marvelous. So these wonderful creatures, these orangutans, they make beds, and they like comfortable beds, and they will use whatever materials, memory foam if available, etc. So in his study, what he did was he looked at the types of beds that these orangutans made, and then he looked at what their performance was like on these cognitive tests that he was giving them. And what he found is that if they only used hay, then their performance, which is on the y-axis going up the left-hand side, was poorer than if they used the memory foam, got their blankets and the pillows, etc., sorted out. So what this suggests is that sleeping safely, sleeping soundly, etc., seems to be really important for our brain to be able to process information. And that maybe it was this that allowed us to leave the safety of the trees and go out onto the open savanna. So it's an intriguing suggestion. Of course, with evolutionary psychology, it's difficult to prove, but the weight of evidence does suggest that there's something quite important going on there. Which is, oh, by the way, if you want to see this, it's Chris Packham's Animal Einsteins. It's one of the best series I've seen for a very long time, so I would highly recommend it. And for those of you who know how much I adore David Attenborough's work, I think this is the new David Attenborough, so do try to watch it on iPlayer if you can. Okay, now finally I'm going to talk about learning and memory. And this is to do with us demonstrating in humans what the advantage of sleep is. And this is work that was done by Ellen Bogan and colleagues, and it's really quite seminal, amazing work to look at how sleep is important in our creation of memories, and also how it helps us stave off the difficulties of other information that might make us forget. And I'll demonstrate it to you now. So in this study, what they did is they taught people pairs of words. So for example, table and shawl. So the idea was that you learned that every time I say table, you have to give me the word shawl. And these pairs were created such that they weren't linked semantically. So you had to learn to put them together. So it's not like black and white, which is easy to learn. So table and shawl, they're not related. So they teach them, and there's the black bars, at a particular point, and then they would test people 12 hours later. Now, in this particular condition that I've highlighted here, they were taught at 9 o'clock in the evening, and then they had some sleep, and they were then tested on table and shawl at 9 o'clock in the morning. So basically, they just had sleep in the interim. Or they taught them at 9 o'clock in the morning and tested them at 9 o'clock in the evening. And here, because you've been awake, other things have happened, you've heard other words, etc., etc. So in this condition, what they're looking at is whether sleep at some level helps your memory. And that's indeed what they find, that people who had the sleep in between learning the table and shawl and then being tested in the morning, they did perform better than the people who'd been in the wake condition, where they were learnt it in the morning and then were tested in the evening. But then the next thing that they did, which is the really interesting and important thing, is that they tried to mess with people's learning by teaching them something else. So having taught table and shawl, before testing, they taught them something else, like table and apple. So they also taught them table and apple to try to confuse them. And then they tested them on the original table, and you have to say shawl rather than apple. So what they wanted to see was whether, if you're taught something else, whether it confuses you and interferes with the information that you've already stored before. So again, they did this with a sleep condition and with an awake condition, where table and shawl here in the morning, then they taught them the table, apple in the evening, before testing them on table and shawl. So the only difference here is that you've had sleep in one condition and you've been awake during the other. And we want to see the effect of this annoying, interfering information in red. Does it have an impact? Well, remarkably, what's found is that if you are awake and you haven't had a sleep yet, your performance goes down enormously. So if I taught you something in the morning, and then just before I was going to test you on that information in the evening, I tried to teach you something else, your ability to remember the information that I taught you in the morning is going to be poorer. Whereas if I taught you something in the evening and then you had a sleep, and then the following morning I taught you something else, that would not interfere with the learning that you've just had. Now, this is quite important because it's not to do with physical rest. There's something that's happening during sleep which is helping with what we call consolidation. Consolidation is a neural process where the brain connections that allow us to, first of all, learn something and then remember it later on are strengthened during sleep. And it seems that this is happening during the REM sleep. And this is happening in an area called the hippocampus, which is a horseshoe-shaped structure about 1.5 inches in from your temples. And it's probably the case that the hippocampus requires this REM sleep to do its consolidation. So this has quite important implications for us learning what to do when we're trying to learn something for remembering it later on. So the suggestion from this would be learn it in the evening before sleep, because then while you're sleeping, that REM sleep in the hippocampus is going to allow you to strengthen this memory, so that in the morning, even if someone throws some more information at you, you've already strengthened the learning that you already have. So there's a lot of work that's happening in this area now, and we know, for example, that older people, their sleep can get more disrupted, as I showed you earlier, and we know that they're more affected in memory tasks, and that might be a causal contributor to the dementia. which therefore brings me finally to the work that we're doing. And this is my amazing PhD student, Terry McGibbon. And we're using a paradigm like the one that I've just told you about for looking at memory, but we're not doing it with sleep. We're just teaching people word pairs like table and shawl, and then testing them half an hour later or an hour later. Uh, Now, this is a really important study called MEAD that we're doing. It's all online. This is the URL for it. And in the Memory, Alzheimer's and Dementia project, what we're trying to do is to map memory across the lifespan from the age of 18 through to the 80. We want to see how does the general public perform on our task. We want to see how people forget. So in this task, we will teach you pairs like table and shawl. And then after we've taught them to you, we want you to come back to our website just an hour later. And when you come back an hour later, you just have to spend 2 minutes doing a 2-minute test. So we'll show you table and we'll ask you to type in the word that goes with it. And then we want you to come back 24 hours later to see what your memory is like a day later. Now, we're hoping that the results from our studies will help us to diagnose dementia earlier than is currently possible. And we know that dementia is a massive problem for society globally, and to help people with dementia and their families who are seeing their loved ones suffer so horribly, we really need to get better at diagnosing dementia. So I'd be really grateful if anyone who hasn't done our test takes down that URL and tries out our task. Just so you know, the first bit where you're learning takes about 20 minutes, and you need to be in a situation where you're not going to be disturbed because you only get one chance to learn it. And after that 20-minute learning, we need you to come back an hour later and then one day later. So if you're able to do this as a thank you for attending my talk, I'd be really grateful. Okay, finally, as you can see, I started off with a scare story about the problems of sleep or sleep deprivation, and then I've gone on to the benefits of sleep. Now, this is an advert, looks like an advert, and with this accompanying statement, which is that scientists have discovered a revolutionary new treatment that makes you live longer. It enhances your memory and makes you more creative. It makes you look more attractive, keeps you slim and lowers food cravings. It protects you from cancer and dementia. It wards off colds and the flu. It lowers your risk of heart attack and stroke, not to mention diabetes. You'll even feel happier, less depressed, and less anxious. Are you interested? Well, this advert is not describing some miracle drug, but rather the proven benefits of a full night's sleep. And this is all highlighted in a wonderful book called Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, who's a British neuroscientist who specializes in sleep. He works in the States, and this is a book from which Claudia and Dominic found a lot of really useful information. And it's a popular science book, so it's not textbook, it's for the layperson. And in this, Matt Walker beautifully demonstrates why sleep is important and some benefits of it and how you might be able to improve your own sleep. So I would recommend it if you want to know more about sleep. So as a summary, there are multiple negative consequences of poor sleep. There are physical, these negative consequences are physical as well as on mental health. And the architecture of sleep is complex, and this also changes across our lifetime. And the human sleep architecture seems to be the most efficient of all animals. So even compared to other primates, we sleep less and yet have more, a bigger proportion of our sleep is devoted to this really important rapid eye movement sleep, which is when we think a lot of brain cleaning and consolidation is happening. And work on primates has shown a link between quality of sleep and cognitive abilities, and this therefore suggests an evolutionary advantage of better sleep. And now research is beginning to demonstrate the benefits on learning and memory of sleep, and these findings should ultimately have impacts on societal attitudes to education, sleeping patterns, etc. So this is a really important new area which demonstrates that sleep isn't for physical rest, it's doing much more than that, and there are some potentially negative consequences of not sleeping well, but also positive consequences of sleeping well. Okay, that's the talk finished. If you'd like to take part in our research, we'd love you to get in touch with us. This is our email address, art.goal.mind@gmail.com, and we'd like you to include your name, age, gender, any neurological conditions if you have any, like epilepsy, or even or cognitive difficulties such as aphantasia or dyslexia, etc., or even strengths. If you're particularly good at memory, particularly good at sleep, anything like that, we'd like to know. These are our social media platforms or accounts. Please follow us, and if you want to find out more about my research team Art, then you can visit our website. And if your organization would like me to give a talk on any of the subjects that I've spoken on, then please feel free to contact me. So all that's left for me to say is thank you for tuning in. The next talk will probably be this time next week on the neuropsychology of addiction, and it will probably be my last talk for a long time on online, because I found that giving these talks has been really draining on me. So we're going to be changing the way we do things, and so these live talks are coming to an end after next week. And finally, you get to see my lovely mummy again, and this is the photograph I kiss every morning and every night. So there you go. I'm now going to have a 3-minute break, and if you would like to ask any questions, please send them via the comment section on Facebook, and I'll be back in a few minutes to answer them.